Welcome back, everyone, to the People's Academy. In the last unit, we looked at international law. Actually, wait, Farwa, can you welcome back, everyone, to the People's Academy? Sorry, technical glitch happens sometimes. Okay, there we go. We'll just start again. So, welcome, everyone, to the People's Academy. We are now in Unit 5 of Chapter 2. We'll be focusing on sanctions. In the previous unit, we looked at international law. We considered its origins in the colonial encounter, its historical use to guarantee impunity for colonial and imperial powers, and its role in dividing humanity into categories of the civilized and the uncivilized. In this session, we'll focus on sanctions in particular as an instrument of warfare. Since the end of the Cold War, the United States, the United Nations, Security Council, the European Union, and other primarily Western countries have dramatically escalated the use of sanctions, which are sometimes also called unilateral coercive measures, in peacetime. And in the past few decades, there's been a concerted effort also to legitimate sanctions as a lawful and legitimate instrument to punish rogue states, or in fact, to punish states that refuse to submit to the imperialist world system. The effects of sanctions have been brutal. Many of you will have seen the recent research carried out by the Center for Economic Policy Research, which put the global death toll of US and EU sanctions at 30 million people over a period spanning 50 years between 1971 and I think 2021. We know from United Nations reports that US sanctions killed 500,000 children in Iraq alone in the 1990s, a price that US Secretary of State Madeleine Albright infamously said was worth it. But beyond causing suffering, sanctions have also maintained inequality among nations, preserving the racial hierarchy of the colonial order in the international system. And to help us understand sanctions, to look into how they work, how they have been applied, and what states are now doing to maneuver around them, we are joined by Dr. Farwa Sial. Farwa is the Asia Regional Director for Research and Advocacy at IDEAS, the International Development Economics Associates. She is also a research associate with the Department of Economics at SOAS University of London. Farwa, thank you so much for being with us today. Over to you.
Hi, and thank you so much, Powell, Mira, Jorge, and everybody who's involved at the People's Academy at Progressive International. I'm very happy to contribute, and I've learned a lot from the previous sessions, some of which I could watch with the time that I had. So today's lecture, as you know, is on sanctions as warfare, and Powell already mentioned this figure of 500,000 children which died directly as a result of sanctions. And this is a picture of funeral procession in Iraq, which really brings this the nature of sanctions at home, really. Of course, we don't need to see this with the ongoing genocide. But today we're going to focus on the lecture, and I have this outline where I wanted to do a couple of things. First, to introduce sanctions and their primary goal, in contrast to the analysis by mainstream economics, by mainstream legal theory, and to really understand why they're not neutral instruments of coercion per se, or instruments which are designed to deter or as a deterrent to war. And here, the goals are simply to make the case that sanctions are important tools in the economic and political sabotage of global South economies. At the same time, also reinforce the point that the question is not simply humanitarian. Of course, that's very important, but sanctions need to be understood in their role in the totality of the imperial project, which not only cause generational suffering, but are also ultimately designed to implement a material paralysis on the economic activity liberation movement and political consciousness of any economy. I will then move on to a timeline of sanctions. So we really need to understand how they're not a monolithic tool, and they've evolved with the rise or the expansion of the US imperial order. I will then look at the question of legality of sanctions. So I'm not a lawyer. I don't work on international law, but I want to map a picture of where sanctions stand institutionally and legally. And then come to our main point, which is to understand sanctions as warfare or really as an act of war. Then I want to look at a case study of Iraq, which we started with the image of Iraq. So I want to understand why Iraq is so important in understanding sanctions, along with other countries, of course. While we consider the coercive or the warfare role of sanctions, it's also important to ask the questions if sanctions can be an anti-imperial tool. And finally, I want to make a few points on the current role of sanctions as a delinking mechanism, looking at recent developments such as the BRICS, the Shanghai Cooperation Organization Summit, which happened, and what it means for South-South integration and the New World Order at the time. So this is a very simple, non-legal definition of sanctions. I think it's quite comprehensive because it's focusing on the withdrawal of customary trade, financial relations for foreign and security policy, but also looking at the long-standing case of U.S. embargo of Cuba. It's a non-political definition, which is not looking at the comprehensive or overall political impact of sanctions, but I think we start from here. On the right is a map produced by the Venezuelan Anti-Blockade Observatory, which shows the list of most sanctioned countries in 2023. And this has been updated a couple of days ago, so really in August 2025. And it now means that there are 37,645 sanctions imposed on 30 countries by the US, the EU, and other states. 97% of these measures are concentrated in 9 countries, and the rest of 3% are distributed among 21 countries. So as you can see, at the moment, Russia tops the list, followed by Iran, and then there are sanctions on Ukraine. So 8% on Iran and 3% on Ukraine, and then there is Venezuela, a fourth country with the highest number of concentrated sanctions in almost 10 years, and then we go to Syria, PRDC, and Iraq. There's also a map which just introduces what kind of sanctions there could be. So there are institutions such as the UN, the EU, and the US. And the nature of sanctions could be financial, could be a direct arms embargo, could be diplomatic restrictions, travel bans, commodity or trade restrictions, as well as shipping, aviation restrictions, and so on. They're quite comprehensive. Maybe we have time to get into those. So this is really important because sanctions as an economic tool have a very long and ancient history. And their evolution is embedded in the unipolarity or the rise of the US imperial order, as I was saying. But the historical lineage of sanctions is quite targeted. Economic embargoes were used by the Greeks, by the Romans, and also as a tool of foreign policy. So there was an aspect where they were implemented for a short period of time to enact blockades, trade embargoes against rival kingdoms, for example, and force compliance without resorting to war. But the more modern usage of sanctions as structural multilateral responses evolved in the period of 1919 to 1939, that is after World War I. And the League of Nations implemented the concept of collective security. And Articles 16 and 17 outlined a process where member states would impose economic sanctions on aggressor states to halt military actions. And of course, there was the Abyssinia crisis, which was also a League of Nations test. After Italy invaded Ethiopia, the League imposed economic sanctions on Italy. But the real formation of sanctions happens in the US-USSR standoff with the evolution of a bipolar world, 1945 to 1990. And the UN framework, the UN Charter, authorized the UN Security Council to impose measures. So this is the rise of the UN Security Council, which is very important for transforming US or unilateral sanctions into multilateral sanctions. The US became the dominant unilateral sanctioning power, and it was able to implement extraterritoriality, so applying its laws to foreign companies, foreign individuals. And some key examples which are important here include the Coordinating Committee for Multilateral Export Controls, the COCM, which is a coalition of Western alliance which could embargo strategic technology coming from the Soviet bloc. And of course, this is also the period when the long-standing embargo on Cuba takes place in 1960. There is also the case of anti-apartheid movement, which I'll get to towards the end. But following the end of the Cold War, and of course the implementation of the UN Security Council, there is a surge in multilateral sanctions imposed by the US. So this is really the period where unilateral imperial sanctions become really important. And the UN implements very broad, comprehensive sanctions on Iraq in 1990, Yugoslavia, Haiti. This also leads to something known as smart sanctions, which means that sanctions were almost globally questioned for their role in the humanitarian impact on countries across the world, including Iraq. And there was a pressure to impose smart or targeted sanctions. These could range from sanctions on individuals or on sanctions on specific sectors. But there's a huge literature which now shows that actually their impact, if not as devastating, were equally coercive and destabilizing for countries because if you target an oil sector of an oil exporting country and it's called targeted, that does not mean anything simply because it impacts the entire country. And simply for individuals, if you're targeting conglomerates or companies, that means the entire domestic sector of a country in which the conglomerate is really large is laid off and so on. Of course, more importantly, they are a direct assault on a sovereign nation. So sovereignty is the fundamental issue here. In the 21st century, so since 9/11, sanctions have become exceedingly violent, exceedingly visible. But the 21st century take on a different turn with sanctions on Russia since 2014, Russia's annexation of Crimea, and the full-scale invasion in 2012 leads to an escalation of sanctions on Russia, but also on Iran since 2012. And these sanctions are becoming increasingly complex. They are more financialized in nature because they target, for example, central banks of a country. And they are very aggressive in not simply targeting the entire supply chain of a country, but entire sectors, and almost producing, for example, in the case of Iran, Venezuela, and Cuba, deepening the moat even further so that there are no avenues for relations with neighboring countries, which offered a respite to these countries. So in summary, sanctions have evolved from simple ancient embargo or a tool to a very sophisticated, highly destructive instrument of empire. And we see the impact now in many different forms, including a very concerted attempt to counter sanctions through gradual as well as coordinated attempts at some form of relinking with other countries as well as delinking with the US order. And I'll get to that in the last slide. So when it comes to international law, as I said earlier, there could be unilateral sanctions and there are multilateral sanctions. And this very simplistic table is designed to provide an overview of the kind of sanctions, the primary sanctions, which are really important. So the UN has a collective security instrument under international law, and its authority to impose sanctions is derived from its founding charter. I already mentioned Article 41. So the UN Security Council becomes the authority to mandate coercive, non-military measures to maintain or restore international peace and security. And these decisions are legally binding on 193 UN member states. So this is important to remember when we speak about the comprehensive nature of the multilateral aspect of the UN. The EU sanction regime is quite complex because it involves both the foreign policy of the UN as well as the legal system of its 27 member states. So the EU's ability to impose sanctions, which it officially called restrictive measures, is based on these founding treaties. So the Common Foreign and Security Policy, CFSP, and the Treaty on European Union, Article 29 of this treaty. The EU can adopt two types of sanctions: autonomous EU sanctions. So these are adopted independently by the EU to achieve its objectives, as well as UN sanctions. So once an EU regulation is adopted, it is directly applicable on all member states. However, member states are responsible for enforcement. At the same time, there are the unilateral sanctions. So these range from the US. So for example, the US IEEPA, which is I've forgotten the acronym, it's in the next slide, but it's an example of a domestic law which is unilateral by the US, as well as the newly implemented Sanctions and Anti-Money Laundering Act, which became active in the UK after Brexit in 2018. And of course, there are numerous other examples. And the right, you also see a chart which shows actually that these are sanctions beyond the legality are implemented almost by all multilateral institutions, the UN, Europe, as well as the US and other countries collectively. So of course it depends on countries, and of course it depends on the consensus in the Security Council. But in terms of impact, in terms of these countries acting as a collective punishing body, these sanctions go a long way, and to countries very diverse, as you can see. Now, the question of, are sanctions actually global, or are they simply American-led imperialism, I think right now is quite easy to follow, because day before yesterday, the US implemented sanctions on 3 humanitarian organizations operating in Palestine, in Gaza, in the middle of a genocide. So we can take this as a starting point, but again, these are some examples of US sanctions which emerged from domestic law, IEEPA, the International Emergency Economic Powers Act, the Magnitsky Act, which was implemented in 2012, then reinforced in 2016, as well as other country-specific acts which are almost whimsical, with a lot of destabilizing and destructive intent behind. And the important thing also to remember here is that when it comes to the Security Council, there is consensus by the Big Five in certain cases, but also there is a lack of consensus when it comes to Venezuela, when it comes to Cuba. So Russia and China, for example, have not voted in the case of Venezuela as well as Cuba. Nonetheless, we do see that both countries actually not only experience sanctions, but a full-scale embargo. So the case for sanctions, emerging solely from the US, then with consensus with the G7 countries, mostly in the EU, and then becoming this multilateral sort of apparatus is very clear now. This brings us to the question of why we should consider sanctions as warfare or war. Very simply, the first point is that it's a handful of Western countries led by the US who have the power to sanction the rest of the world. We can debate about the role, the reform of the UN, for example, or we can talk about, you know, a little bit of tinkering here and there. But through every institution, what clearly comes out is that it's a very linear, racist, racialized project, which targets countries in the global south. And beyond Russia, it's not been implemented in any comprehensive fashion on any Western countries. It targets a host of industries, as I was talking about earlier. So in terms of the productive capacity of a country, it can lead to complete paralysis because it's aviation, it's steel mills, it's manufacturing, it's oil processing. At the same time, it's also anti-regional. So if you neighbor a country which is sanctioned, this is a direct inability of your country to trade with that country. So it's not simply a deterrent mechanism for one country, but goes beyond that. Second and very important point, which is made by critical legal scholars as well as some political economists, is that we need to understand sanctions as a tool of violence which masquerades as neutral policy. So this is something Powell was already talking about, the study which has just come out. And it's talking about sanctions as compared to armed conflicts. And of course, some of these studies have been there for a long time. It's just that they've not gained the attention that they should. Even with the sort of egregious case with Iraq, the impact was not analyzed in any coherent fashion. The next point is on no such thing as smarter humanitarian sanctions. I already spoke about them. So once again, we need to understand that sanctions are an assault on the sovereignty of a country, and they should be understood in their role and their impact through the collective unity of an imperialist agenda. At the same time, sanctions are also against the emergence of third world liberation. They're against the material and political basis of any solidarity that can emerge. And this is very important because if you think about free trade regulations or free economic zones, for example, or the very idea of free trade, in many ways, sanctions are antithetical to them. But the two coexist or are designed in a way that they are interacting at the same time in many different shapes. So there is a contradiction which defines capitalism, and sanctions as an imperial project are one of the most visible forms of that contradiction. The other role of sanctions, which is really important, is the role of sanctions as order making, which is that they are the institutionalization of liberal and post-liberal order, norms, culture. So this glorification, not simply acquiescence of the concept of regime change, which is rooted in this idea of an authoritarian dictator, is one of the rationale for sanctions. And without the need for a construct of sanctions as a necessity of something which is below war or something which is less violent, you cannot implement sanctions as you do. Unfortunately, many Western NGOs also believe and have also been advocating for sanctions as a lesser form of war and as an alternative to war, given this mentality. So it's also very important to take account of the norms and the cultural role of sanctions and the narrative which accompanies them. Additionally, the role of Bretton Woods institution is also very important in terms of how they engage with sanctioned countries and how they implement aid, how they implement loans, and the so-called developmental framework which accompanies them. Finally, sanctions are a prelude to war and a postlude to invasion and military warfare. We have the core case of Iraq, for example. After 2003 concerted sanctions, Iraq was invaded by the US. Sanctions also accompanied the 10 plus years of US invasion in Afghanistan. And when Taliban seized power in 2001, the US and Western countries recently seized $9.1 billion of Afghan's external reserves, which were originally part of the Afghanistan Bank or Afghanistan Central Bank. So this freezing of money, which is basically Afghan money, could not have taken place without the debilitating impact of sanctions and war in Afghanistan. And of course, we see the recent threats in Venezuela. They're more than threats, actually. And we only have to wonder how strong Venezuela's ability to respond could be had it been able to have a defensive mechanism without sanctions for all these years. On the right, there's a list of organizations which have been doing important work in raising awareness, analysis, research, and testimonials on sanctions. So if you're interested in analyzing specific countries or just having an overview of how sanctions should actually be studied in international law and political economy, please have a look at their work. So this is a case study of how sanctions actually can be leveraged as conduits of transnational monopoly capital. And it's the case of UN Oil for Food program, which was implemented in Iraq. This is very important for many reasons. First is that, just to give you an introduction, the UN Oil for Food program was implemented between 1996 and 2003, before Iraq was invaded by the US. And the purpose was, under the auspices of US, to ameliorate the developmental and humanitarian impact of sanctions by allowing Iraqi populations to sell their oil in exchange for food and items of necessities. So by its very nature, this program is actually quite coercive because it's giving this sort of Faustian bargain to Iraq that you are under these extreme sanctions, your population is suffering, but if you sell oil, this is a humanitarian token which can help you in multiple ways. So by design, the project is flawed, of course, but the program also became very famous through a large reporting of endemic corruption. Reports by numerous agencies found that there was a lot of corruption in this program from the very beginning. So from the beginning 1990s. But the emphasis was primarily on corrupt Iraqis who were siphoning off funds to support Saddam Hussein's so-called illicit activities. But if you actually go through the legal documentation, the paperwork, and look at the true nature of the UN Oil program, it was actually a case of transnational global corruption because it implicated various and diverse set of actors, including the US. The Volcker report, for example, mentions 200 companies, and these are the companies which it actually could analyze. It couldn't, the scale was so widespread, the looting of Iraq was so widespread that it was impossible to actually map where this money went from. So diverse countries ranging from Pakistan to Latin America benefited. And in a way, this was a project of transnational elites, as well as under the auspices of US corporates, individual who benefited from this program. I mentioned this in a forthcoming paper for the Middle East critique. But there are details which we cannot access. There are details which were never made public, which were never known because the scale was so huge. And of course, there were multiple lawsuits which did not become public. So Total, the oil company, for example, had a long lawsuit, but it was dropped, I think, in 2023 because there wasn't enough evidence to pursue. So we're not simply talking about sanctions as humanitarian problem. They are a very important tool in supporting or complementing monopoly capital, which is transnational in nature, but which leads towards to the US in terms of how it operates. This critique of sanctions also merits the question of whether sanctions can be an anti-imperial tool and whether there are instances when sanctions were used in a way which was actually designed to punish actual genocidal or rogue regimes such as the one in apartheid South Africa. And it's also a dismal history because, as you see, the National Party in South Africa implemented apartheid laws in 1948, and the first results on sanctions came 29 years later. So there are major delays, 1962, Resolution 1761, and 15 years later, you have Resolution 418 in 1977. And there is a complex interplay of actors which are trying to block the sanctions in every shape and form. There are economic interests, there are geopolitical interests. So, for example, South Africa was seen as an undesirable anti-communist ally. And of course, the apartheid regime could, coerce a lot of small states, but also allies. So 1977, 4th November is when it actually comes to light. And 29 years is a long time. And with the current situation where there is nothing tangible when it comes to sanctions against Israel, this is not a hopeful case. In fact, it just goes to show how the UN has consistently been a multilateral body which has failed countries, which has failed human beings. And in fact, the sanctions, the most important thing about the apartheid regime is that sanctions became almost undeniable by countries because there was a lot of transnational activism by NGOs, by individuals, something that we see right now with groups. So there was a lot of pressure which led to the implementation of sanctions and, of course, the withdrawal of the apartheid regime then. And the question now, historically, where we stand is that that possibility seems quite difficult because the degree of violence, because the degree of decay of the empire is so strong that it keeps coming back to citizens, to groups which take action even very, very strongly. And of course, 29 years is not justice in any way. So sanctions can be an anti-imperial tool depending on their quick implementation, depending on consensus, and depending on the UN being a body that actually acts in the interest of global South countries. So this is my last slide. Here I wanted to talk about the question of sanctions as a form of delinking. What are they doing or what can they do for countries of the global South? And this is a very interesting paper by Sitare Siddiqui and Christopher Weaver in the Middle East Critique, which is looking at two of the most sanctioned countries in the world, Iran and Cuba, and how they have been gradually moving towards a path towards economic self-sufficiency, using in oil, food production, finding new trading partners, moving towards new diplomacy because of a direct result of sanctions and the political pressure they're under. There is a lot of research to be done in the specific ways in which economic diversification has been achieved by these countries. And it's not simply the question of sanctions. There is an anti-imperial ideology which binds these countries together, which unfortunately a lot of mainstream political economics, as well as legal literature, sort of cardons off as this attempt where they're rallying behind the leader or rallying behind an illegal state, which is, of course, an attempt to undermine what these countries have achieved. But we can also think about the case of Vietnam, for example. It's surprising to think that even with the implementation of Doi Moi, or the so-called drive to self-sufficiency through liberal reforms that Vietnam has, it's not very long before, when Vietnam had a lot of sanctions on it. So the trajectory from a very sanctioned state to a state which is doing well under a market socialism such as Vietnam also gives us lessons about how sanctions can push states towards ways of economic self-sufficiency, which are actually never studied by a lot of scholars and so on. At the same time, I think now we are in a world which gives us no choice. Um, when countries are really complaining about economic tariffs, of course, they're really high, 50%, 15%, depending on who the country is, they have a devastating impact on economies. But we can learn from sanctioned countries which have been experiencing this historically through a very long time. And therefore, there is a very close relationship in what tariffs pose for countries and what sanctioned countries have experienced for a long time. At the same time, we have to remember that 54 countries are in acute debt distress situation. This means that not only do they face, egregious IMF surcharges, debt repayments, there is a massive inflation, acute dollar dependency, as well as destabilization of currency. And if you happen to be a country which is near sanctioned countries or in the region of sanctions, this is a devastating situation. So in other words, we are entering a world for a lot of developing or global South countries, which is a world without choice and which needs to be analyzed in detail. So BRICS countries, and we can have a long debate about BRICS following liberal or neoliberal order in some way, not doing enough. But we have to remember that Russia is sanctioned. China is an outlier. And BRICS as a whole are forced to follow the dollar hegemony. But they also represent a bloc which is moving towards gradual transformation as the tariffs are expanding, as new blocks are forming. So the latest Shanghai Cooperation Organization concluded with the SCO, or Shanghai Cooperation Bank, which is moving towards a different trajectory where it's not letting go of the problem of dollarization, but forming new blocks, which open ways to trade between countries. So basically accelerate what was happening with the Belt Road, but in ways which now follows alternatives to payments, for example, in the form of SWIFT, but also a new multilateral regional partnership, which has not existed before. So these are some of the ways in which dollar sanctions and tariffs and the changing world order as it becomes more violent is opening up ways. And I think there is a need to analyze this more, but also highlight the role of sanctions in pushing these countries collectively. So I'll stop here.
Thank you so much for that, Farwa. I wonder, since we have a bit of time left, if I could jump in with a few questions.
Yeah.
I find this idea of sanctions as as a form of, or a path towards delinking very interesting. I was reading this piece a few days ago by James Galbraith, who argued that the sanctions against Russia appeared, he said, in the nature of a gift. And there are a few reasons for that, but I think the most important are that the cutting off of Western capital from Russia created the political conditions for the country to adopt protectionist measures, industrial policies, to expel foreign firms, to implement capital controls. These are all things that would have been very difficult to do politically in the absence of sanctions. And the other argument I think that's really interesting is that it pertains especially to energy, is that by cutting itself off from affordable Russian oil and gas, Europe effectively got hit with the brunt of the damage of the sanctions assault, whereas Russia, even though it saw diminishing oil and gas exports, in fact, saw the losses from that nullified by the rising prices, which were also caused by the sanctions. So you had this situation in which Russia actually benefited, and the architects of the sanctions saw them boomerang back against, against themselves. And so I wonder, you talked a little bit about what it takes for states to build the capacities to resist sanctions, but I wonder if you could say a little bit more about whether you see sanctions becoming ineffective at some point as these new international frameworks led by the Global South strengthen.
Yeah, thanks, Paul. This is what you say about Russia is very interesting because um, I think a couple of months ago there was an article in the FT where it was forced to admit that sanctions against Russia are not working. So there has been a back and forth on if they're working less, how could they be more effective, to now them saying it's not working. And I think that when we speak about countries like Russia, China, and even Iran, they have a certain capacities which a lot of global South countries, small island countries, for example, do not have. So sanctions can deter, can induce aspects of economic self-sufficiency if there is a collective attempt by countries to face them. We see that with the happening under the auspices of China and Asia, for example. And I think the we need to sort of wait and see what happens in the future with respect to Latin America and Asia in that sense. If we believe that Latin America would be at the offensive of the US and so on. But at the same time, you have to remember that sanctions work because they are devastating, because they are economically leading to a paralysis which cannot be reversed. You have to remember that right now, countries of the global south, for example, Pakistan, are facing unprecedented devastation due to climate, which means that the migration challenge is huge. So the countries are not simply lacking the economic means, they're also experiencing brain drain, they're also experiencing extreme hollowing out, which has been happening for a long time, but now is escalating in many different forms and shapes. So once again, the ability of sanctions or tariffs to be completely ineffective would depend on how countries collectively come together to say no. And frankly, if we are talking about tariffs, one of the things that should have worked in the face of tariffs with something like 50% and 15 or 7% even, is that countries should have regionally come together to have a collective no. That kind of third world solidarity is something which needs to be built, which needs to be given confidence. And the BRICS can do it, the Shanghai Summit can do it, and so on. Yeah, sorry, I just saw this sinus sharing my screen.
No, no worries. I just stopped sharing it because it was still on the stream. Thank you for that. I suppose one other thing that I wanted to pick up on from what you talked about is the relationship of sanctions and processes of national liberation. You talked about sanctions as an instrument to thwart national liberation struggles and stymie national sovereignty. And I wonder if you could say a little bit more about the relationship between terrorist designations and sanctions, because that seems to be a tool that's been used very effectively to discredit and weaken support for projects of national liberation. Of course, most recently in Palestine, but this is certainly not the first case where this is used.
Yeah, so along with the sanctions regime or targeted sanctions, there are also international legal norms, such as the FATF, that is the Financial Action Task Force, which which lists country into these different colors. So the gray listing by the FATF would mean that certain countries are involved in terrorism, therefore their rating goes down, which means that it impacts their ability to have access to international finance and capital, which of course is really important. So there are multiple ways in which the sanctions as well as the legal framework can implement cessation of capital inflows into a country, which then is extremely devastating for the country. But it has this umbrella term of terrorism, of Islamic fundamentalism, and so on. And this has never been discredited to the extent that we see now with the genocide. So it's become suddenly very apparent to a large and diverse number of groups that actually did believe in the sanctity of Western liberal order or Western law to a large degree, that there are massive holes. So these, of course, this kind of post-truth world was always visible to countries of the global south, but this is becoming very visible to now the so-called international community, for lack of a better term. So there are multiple ways, and terrorism and action against militant groups involved in national liberation, which is of course a right under the UN, have been woven into sanctions in many different ways. And as I mentioned, three humanitarian organizations, which even a lot of liberal organizations such as Amnesty agree are humanitarian and therefore should not be sanctioned, are now being sanctioned. So we are beyond that world at the moment. And of course, one aspect of sanctions thwarting national liberation is the fact that it simply hampers independent intellectual thought. Schools, universities in the global south, independent thinkers, intellectuals are almost, non-existent because sanctions, as I said, push migration, sanctions, hollow out institutions, and sanctions basically cordon off the next generation. So this is how we can understand.
Thank you for that, Farwa. I think we can slowly start to wrap up. I just say a couple of words about the upcoming class, which is the penultimate unit of this chapter of the curriculum, where the lecture will be streamed in 2 weeks' time. That is on the role of the dollar in the international system, very relevant also to today's discussion and efforts to delink from the dollar. And then we will conclude 2 weeks after that with the final unit of this chapter on global fascism, which will be taught by Matteo Capasso. So Farwa, I want to thank you once again. That was a really useful and very clear lecture, which I found especially interesting. I was rereading recently a speech that US President Woodrow Wilson gave, I think in 1919 or something, where he said that sanctions are an instrument infinitely more terrible than war because they effectively suffocate a country that, he said, all inclinations to fight back. And of course, with time, we've seen that that's exactly true. And of course, we can see in this statement that the imperialists know exactly what they're doing when they're implementing sanctions against the state. The same, of course, is true of Cuba, where the infamous 1960 State Department memorandum inaugurating the blockade set out its intent as denying food and supplies to Cuba with the aim of generating popular discontent and ultimately leading to the overthrow of its socialist government. So far, once again, thank you. That was really clear. I've also shared the additional reading that you sent me with participants in the course. And if there's anything else that you feel would be useful for people to read or review, please feel free to share it with me and I'll pass it on to
Thanks.
everyone
Thank you.
else. Thank you.